It began with a stain. August of 1974, on Chase Street in West Pittston, Pennsylvania, a faint, brownish discoloration that appeared on the new carpeting, spreading like a phantom bruise beneath the feet of the Smurl family. Jack and Janet Smurl, along with their two young daughters, Dawn and Heather, had just moved into the duplex. It was an old house, a place with history etched into its floorboards, but they were making it a home. They scrubbed the stain, but it always returned, a stubborn ghost of a mark. Then came the smells, a foul, sulphurous odor that would drift through rooms with no warning, clinging to the air before vanishing as quickly as it came. These were small things, easily dismissed. Old house problems, faulty plumbing, the rationalizations we build to keep the walls of our reality secure. The house on Chase Street was more than just a home. It was a promise. Bought with their savings, it represented stability, a place to raise their growing family. Jack worked as a regional credit manager, Janet as a homemaker. They were ordinary people living an ordinary life in a quiet, working-class town nestled in the Wyoming Valley. But the ordinary soon began to fray at the edges. The television would flicker on by itself, channels flipping in a chaotic dance. A radio, unplugged and silent in the corner, would suddenly blare music into the dead of night. Footsteps echoed from the empty upstairs hallway, heavy and deliberate, while the entire family was downstairs watching TV. The temperature would plummet in a single room, a pocket of Arctic cold so intense you could see your breath, while the rest of the house remained warm. It was the little, personal moments that truly started to sow the seeds of terror. Janet would be in the kitchen and feel an icy hand brush against the back of her neck, only to turn and find no one there. Jack, a man of steady nerves, would hear his name whispered from a vacant room, a sibilant, beckoning sound that made the hair on his arms stand on end. The daughters complained of unseen hands pulling their blankets off in the middle of the night, of dark shapes that seemed to watch them from the corners of their rooms. These weren't just bumps in the night. They were targeted, intimate violations of their sanctuary. The fear was a slow-acting poison, seeping into the foundations of their family life, creating fault lines of anxiety and doubt. The activity escalated from strange to overtly hostile. Black, amorphous masses would materialize in doorways, solid and menacing, before dissipating into thin air. A chandelier swayed violently, threatening to crash down in a room with no drafts. The scratches started appearing, long, deep gouges on the wooden doors and walls, as if a large animal was trying to claw its way in or out. The family dog, a German shepherd, would cower and whine, refusing to enter certain parts of the house, its eyes fixed on something unseen. The Smurrls were no longer just unnerved. They were besieged. The very architecture of their home, the wood and plaster, meant to protect them, now felt like a cage they shared with an unseen, malevolent force. Their story was a secret kept behind closed doors, a shame they couldn't share with neighbors or friends. Who would believe them? They were devout Catholics, pillars of their small community. To admit their house was haunted was to invite ridicule, to be branded as unstable or attention-seeking. They were trapped in a paradox. The events were too real to ignore, but too fantastic to explain. Their world had shrunk to the four walls of that house on Chase Street, a place where the laws of physics and reason no longer seemed to apply. The fight for their home and for their sanity was just beginning. Then came the physical attacks. One night, A violent shaking roused the entire house, as if it were being lifted from its foundation and dropped. Jack felt himself pinned to the bed, an invisible weight pressing down, while a succubus-like figure violated him in the darkness. Janet was thrown from her bed, landing hard on the floor, the wind knocked out of her. The entity, or entities, had crossed a final, terrifying line. This was no longer a haunting, it was an assault. The whispers had become a roar, the cold spots a suffocating presence. The Smurls were living in a war zone, and the enemy was something they couldn't see, couldn't fight, and couldn't understand. Their pleas to the church for help had just begun, a desperate gambit against a power that seemed to be growing stronger with each passing day. The phone call ended, but the silence didn't return. Instead, a new rhythm began. It wasn't the playful tapping of before. It was a heavy, deliberate pounding. Thump, thump, thump. It started on the shared wall with Don and Mary's side of the duplex, loud enough to rattle the cheap prints hanging in the hallway. Janet and Jack would freeze, their eyes meeting across the dinner table. On the other side of the wall, they knew Don and Mary were doing the same, listening, waiting. The kids would look up from their homework, their faces pale. The pounding would travel, moving from the living room wall to the kitchen, then up the stairs, as if something was methodically searching for them, room by room. Sleep became a forgotten luxury. The nights were a siege. The family dog, a normally boisterous mutt, would press itself into a corner, whimpering, its eyes fixed on an empty spot in the room. It would refuse to cross the threshold into the master bedroom, planting its paws and whining until they gave up. A heavy glass light fixture in the dining room began to sway, slowly at first, then with more force, like a pendulum marking some unseen, malevolent time. There was never a draft, never a tremor in the floor. It just moved. The constant tension began to eat away at them. Jack's normally easygoing nature turned brittle. Janet found herself snapping at the girls over spilled milk, her nerves stretched to the breaking point. The daughters, once bubbly and carefree, became withdrawn. Their grades started to slip. At school, they'd flinch at loud noises. At home, they were afraid to go to the bathroom alone. The family started living in a state of quiet, constant calculation. Could they invite friends over? What if the banging started? The whispers in the neighborhood grew louder than the ones in their walls. The Smurls were odd. Something was wrong at that house. They debated endlessly. Telling people would invite ridicule, but not telling felt like a betrayal of their own sanity. Was this really happening? Then a visitor would be there, a friend of one of the girls, or a cousin stopping by, and the noises would start. A rancid, sulphurous odor would roll into the room like a thick fog, making their eyes water, only to vanish moments later. The shared experience was a terrifying kind of validation. They weren't crazy. Holy water, brought from the church, felt like their only weapon. Janet would dip her thumb in the small bottle and trace a cross on her children's foreheads before they attempted sleep. The cold tack of the water on their skin was a fleeting comfort. The clocks in the house became erratic. One on the mantelpiece would stop dead at 3:15 a.m., only to lurch back to life hours later, its ticking unnervingly loud in the quiet house. Plaster dust would sometimes drift down from the ceiling after a particularly violent shudder in the walls, coating their tongues with a gritty, earthy taste. Then, the psychological terror took a physical turn. One of the daughters came crying from her room, a long red scratch welling up on her forearm, with no explanation for how it got there. A bedroom door, left slightly ajar, slammed shut with such force it splintered the frame, narrowly missing Janet's hand as she reached for the knob. A heavy crucifix mounted on the wall slid sideways and crashed to the floor. They were no longer just being haunted, they were being targeted. Desperate, Jack reached out to their parish priest. The conversations were hushed, filled with cautious advice and prayers offered from a polite distance. No one wanted to step inside their world. No one knew what to do. The house felt smaller each day, the walls closing in, the air thick with an energy that was growing bolder, more violent. One Tuesday night, the chaos erupted. It wasn't just pounding anymore. It was a cacophony of crashes, bangs, and a sound like furniture being dragged across the floorboards, coming from every direction at once. It was so loud, so sustained, that their next-door neighbor, a man who usually kept to himself, finally picked up his phone and dialed the police. But as the sound of the approaching siren cut through the night, something else happened. A shadow, darker than the night, detached itself from the side of the house. It wasn't just on their side. It stretched, impossibly long, moving across the entire duplex, enveloping both halves of the building in its formless shape. And from within the walls, a voice spoke. It was clear, guttural, and it wasn't a whisper. It said a single, chilling word that shattered every last defense of denial they had left.
Start speaking immediately after the previous part ends. Their desperate search for answers led them to two of the most famous and controversial names in paranormal investigation: Ed and Lorraine Warren. By this point, the Warrens had built a formidable reputation. They were the investigators behind the Amityville case, seasoned ghost hunters with a distinctly Catholic approach. For the Smurls, the Warrens' arrival was a double-edged sword. On one hand, there was immense relief. Finally, someone not only believed them, but had a framework for what was happening. The Warrens didn't see it as a haunting. They called it a demonic infestation, a methodical oppression aimed at breaking the family apart. On the other hand, their arrival turned the Smurls' private nightmare into a public spectacle. The Warrens' methods were intense and steeped in faith. They organized nightly vigils in the most active rooms, with Jack and Janet joining them. Lorraine, a self-professed clairvoyant, would walk through the house, describing unseen presences, while Ed set up audio recorders, hoping to capture disembodied voices. They led the family in reciting the rosary, their whispered prayers cutting through the tense silence of the house. The family clung to these rituals, these small acts of defiance. The investigators placed blessed medals and crucifixes on doorways, creating what they called spiritual barriers. For the first time, the Smurls felt like they were fighting back, not just enduring. And according to the Warrens, something was fighting back. They reported dramatic drops in temperature, cold spots so intense you could see your breath. Lorraine claimed to see a pulsating, dark, massa-dense, shapeless shadow coalescing in the doorway between the living room and dining room. It seemed to block out all light and sound, a vortex of pure malevolence. The audio recorders, when played back, were allegedly filled with static and, on occasion, guttural phrases. Ed claimed to have captured a voice growling, "Get out." The family, listening to these tapes, felt a chilling validation. The proof they so desperately craved was also the confirmation of their deepest fears. The house was no longer just a home. It had become a battleground. The Warrens' involvement drew a wider circle of attention. They contacted the Diocese of Scranton, urging them to intervene. Cautious clergy members began to visit blessing rooms with holy water and offering prayers. The official stance from the diocese remained distant, acknowledging the family's distress but stopping short of confirming a demonic presence. Then the local paper got wind of the story. A news truck was soon idling at the curb, its camera pointed at their front door. The Smurls' private terror was now a neighborhood curiosity, and with that publicity came a wave of skepticism and scorn. The invisible torment inside the house was now matched by a very public one outside. Neighbors would stare as they mowed their lawns. Classmates whispered and pointed at the Smurl daughters in the school hallways, calling their house haunted. Janet's own parents expressed embarrassment and fear, begging her to stop the nonsense for the sake of the children. The pressure was immense. You could see it in the little things, in Janet's hands, which trembled as she folded laundry, a simple, repetitive task to keep her mind from spiraling. You could see it in Jack's face, his jaw constantly clenched, his mind racing with calculations. Could they afford to move? Could they even sell this house? The girls, caught in the middle of it all, asked the most heartbreaking questions. Can it hear what I'm thinking? Does it know we're scared? The conflict between faith and proof, between private belief and public ridicule, was tearing them apart. The Warrens insisted the only solution was a formal rite of exorcism, a direct confrontation with the entity. After much debate and prayer, the diocese finally authorized a priest to perform an intensified series of blessings, a precursor to the full rite. The family steeled themselves. This was it. This had to be the end of their ordeal. But as they prepared for the confrontation, a palpable shift occurred in the house. The activity didn't lessen. It seemed to gather strength, a quiet, observant malevolence. It was as if the thing in their home knew what was coming and was preparing for a war.
The family brought in help multiple times. The first was a priest, a kind man with gentle eyes, who walked through the rooms with holy water. He prayed in every corner, his voice a steady murmur against the house's oppressive silence. But the air remained thick, heavy, like a storm about to break. A crucifix placed on the bedroom wall would be found on the floor hours later, facing down as if it had been pushed. Another attempt was made, this time with a more forceful blessing. The investigators, Ed and Lorraine Warren, were certain they were dealing with a powerful, inhuman entity. The clergy, however, remained cautious. Speaking of observation and discernment, unwilling to jump to the conclusion of demonic activity. The family tried their own rituals, lighting candles and reciting prayers passed down through generations. But it was like trying to shout down a hurricane. One night, The sound started again, a dry, scratching noise from beneath the floorboards, like 1,000 sharp nails dragging across old wood. It grew louder, more frantic, echoing the frantic beat of their own hearts. Then came the night the house fought back. It began with a single door, the one to the master bedroom, slamming shut with a deafening crack that shook the walls. Then another, and another, until every door in the duplex slammed in unison, a synchronized act of aggression. Janet screamed. Jack rushed to the children's room, finding them huddled together, eyes wide with terror. In the living room, a family photo slid off the mantel and shattered on the hearth. A bedside lamp in the guest room didn't just flicker, it exploded, a sharp pop followed by the tinkle of glass raining onto the carpet. The air grew frigid, and a low groan seemed to emanate from the very foundation of the building. It wasn't just a haunting anymore. It was a siege. The house was alive, and it was angry. They couldn't take it anymore. Exhaustion had etched deep lines onto Jack and Janet's faces. They were living on a razor's edge, parents trying to project a calm they didn't feel for children who just wanted to sleep without fear. Cardboard boxes began to appear in the corners of rooms, symbols of a desperate, unspoken plan. A friend offered a spare room, a temporary haven. But the terror had become portable. One night, staying at a relative's house miles away, Janet woke up shivering, an unnatural cold clinging to her in the guest bedroom. Their eldest daughter, staying with her grandparents, heard a faint whisper of her name from an empty hallway. The horrifying realization dawned on them. It wasn't the house. It was them. The geography of safety had completely collapsed. There was no escape. Skeptics offered logical explanations. Mass hysteria, the power of suggestion amplified by media attention, the physical effects of extreme stress and sleep deprivation. But for the Smurl family, these were just words. Words couldn't explain the slamming doors or the disembodied voices. They couldn't explain the icy chill that followed them wherever they went. Finally, they made the decision. They had to move. They packed their lives into boxes, leaving behind the duplex on Chase Street, a place that had become a prison. They found a new house, a quiet place on a peaceful street. They scrubbed the floors, painted the walls, and tried to build a fortress of normalcy. The first night, they held their breath. The house was silent. A deep, profound, beautiful silence. For the first time in months, they felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, it was over. They went to bed, exhausted but daring to believe in a new beginning. The house was quiet. The street was quiet. The world was quiet. Until it wasn't. The quiet didn't last. For the Smurls, the move to West Pittston was meant to be a fresh start, a clean break. But soon, the chilling realization dawned. It wasn't the house on Chase Street that was haunted. It was them. The phenomena followed, intensifying with a terrifying focus. One night, it all came to a head. The air grew thick and cold. Whispers seemed to curl from the corners of their new rooms, and shadowy figures flickered at the edge of their vision. This wasn't just a haunting, it was a siege. Pushed to the absolute brink, they faced a final, desperate choice. They decided they could no longer fight this battle in the dark. They had to go public. Their story erupted into the national consciousness with the publication of the book, The Haunted. Suddenly, the Smurl's private nightmare was a public spectacle, debated on talk shows and dissected in newspapers. A TV movie followed, dramatizing their torment for millions. The attention brought a storm of both support and scrutiny. The Diocese of Scranton, while acknowledging their involvement, remained cautious, reiterating that they had found no evidence of demonic possession. Skeptics, including paranormal investigators and scientists, publicly challenged the family's claims, pointing to psychological stress or outright fabrication as more likely explanations. The most compelling counterpoint came from the duplex on Chase Street itself. Subsequent tenants reported nothing unusual. Their lives were quiet, ordinary, and completely untroubled by the supernatural. The public debate, however, paled in comparison to the private cost. The constant terror and public exposure frayed the family's bonds. Trust was eroded, not just in the world outside, but sometimes within their own home. Sleep became a luxury they could rarely afford. The children grew up under the immense shadow of a story that defined them, a story the world constantly argued over. Their home, the one place that should have been a sanctuary, had become a battlefield. The disaster wasn't the spectacular events seen on screen, but the slow, grinding collapse of their sense of safety and the long, arduous work of trying to rebuild it, piece by piece, long after the cameras left. Today, the duplex in West Pittston stands quietly on a peaceful street. The paint is fresh, the lawn is neat, and curtains are drawn in the windows. To a passerby, it's just another house, but it holds two histories simultaneously. For one family, it was the epicenter of a terrifying war against an unseen enemy. For others who have lived there since, it's just been a home. It remains a place where one family's reported terror and another's quiet. Ordinary life exists side by side, a silent testament to a story that, depending on who you ask, is either a harrowing true account of supernatural assault or a tragic tale of a family in crisis. The fragile idea of home can be shattered in an instant. For more true stories that test the limits of family, community, and the places we believe are safe, make sure to subscribe. We have many more to share. Thanks for watching.